Okay, here we are again. We're going to pick up where we left off, and that is with the Hebrews. The Hebrews were a large society that had a major impact on ancient civilizations, but they're very different from others in that they never became an empire. They were very much a nation of people as opposed to a nation with a defined physical border, although that would eventually come. And of course be taken away, and then they'd get it back, and just a sort of a vicious cycle. Um, One of the main reason for the impact that the Hebrews had, of course, is how God used them. So we see in Genesis chapter 12, we see the call of Abram. Abram being sort of the father, not sort of, being the father of the Hebrew people. And in that call, God says, hey, leave your father's household and go to the land I will show you. Now, we know about Abram that his dad was a pagan priest. It was not uncommon for priests to also be rulers. If you remember the ziggurats in Sumer, those were not just places of worship, they were places of administration as well. Judicial administration. So his father's a rather important person, and basically Abram worshipped other gods until the one true God calls him and says, leave your father's household, the household of pagan gods, and go to the land I will show you. And it says that he was 70 years old. And within this call, there is a covenant, and a covenant is very much like a commitment. It's a promise, but you know, in our minds, sometimes a promise is not as binding as what we would say is like a legal document, right? If I sign my name to a mortgage, I am legally bound to pay my mortgage, right? And if I don't pay my mortgage, what's going to happen? The house is going to be taken away. But, you know, in some states, if you cheat on your spouse, well, then you've just cheated on your spouse. There's nothing really sort of to hold you accountable for that. So this covenant in the ancient world is very, very important, and it's sacred, and it means quite a bit. So God makes a covenant, a commitment, a sacred oath, a promise that he's going to bless Abram's offspring. Now, Abram is 70 years old and he has no children. And God says, I will bless your offspring and they will outnumber the stars. This land that you're going to go to, that I'm going to show you, this is the promised land that the Hebrews refer to. Let's go to the promised land. And this is the land that God has set aside for them. It's a good land, and he's expecting to bring them there and to bless them. So after Abram receives the call of God to go, he gets up and he goes. The promise of a son inland, as well as prophecies of enslavement and hardship, are eventually fulfilled. Moving on to the next part of the Hebrew story, we see that Abram's descendants are so numerous that they are targeted as a group that nobody really wants to mess with. So we do see eventually Abram, who eventually his name is changed to Abraham. He and his wife Sarah, who are very, very old. It's basically about 2 decades after Abram receives the call to leave his father's house, as well as the covenant that he will bless his offsprings, that we see Abraham and his wife giving birth to a son, and they name him Isaac, which means laughter, or he laughs. And it's Sarah basically laughed because she didn't think that it would happen. She didn't think that she would give birth in her old age. So, but as part of the, you know, God doesn't speak to Abram. He doesn't speak to Abraham every single day. We're talking like years go by in between these different conversations that God has with Abraham. But in the course of some of these conversations, we see prophecies, and a prophecy is a message of God. This is not the idea of a fortune teller. This is very much sort of a divine revelation. It's a direct message from God. Part of this is that the people are going to be enslaved. This is Abram's descendants are going to be enslaved for centuries, but there will be a deliverer. Now, this sounds rather familiar, doesn't it? Because what did God tell Eve? He said, one day you are going to give birth to a son, and he is going to crush the head of the serpent. So we can see God reminding his people that, hey, I will take care of you. I am going to bring a deliverer. There's also this prophetic message that the people are going to turn away time and time again, but after a period of discipline, they will return to Yahweh, the name of their God, or the name of God, I should say, and they will return to him. And this is a recurring cycle throughout Hebrew history. This is just a really interesting thing. If you look in Genesis chapter 14, verse 18, you see this verse. Then Melchizedek, king of Salem, brought out bread and wine. He was priest of God Most High, and he blessed Abram, saying, Blessed be Abram by God Most High, creator of heaven and earth, and blessed be God Most High, who delivered your enemies into your hand. Then Abram gave him a tenth of everything. There's some very interesting things in this verse that I would love to just hit on very quickly, because I absolutely love this. First of all, we see Melchizedek is king of Salem, and this city will eventually become Jerusalem. It says that he was king of Salem, and next it says that he was priest of God Most High. So, first of all, using what we've already learned about the ancient world, we see, first of all, hey, here's a very real example of a king who is also priest. But something else we also see, historically speaking, thinking about the religious beliefs and everyday life. So one, we've got king and priest. Secondly, we have Melchizedek, who is priest of God Most High, the creator of heaven and earth, God Most High. And later on in the book of Hebrews, we see Jesus referred to as a priest in the order of Melchizedek. So Melchizedek is seen as one who believes in Yahweh, who believes in the God of the Hebrews, and he's king of Salem. So what does that tell us? That tells us that not everybody turned away from believing in the one true God who disciplined Adam and Eve and sent them away from the Garden of Eden. And more often than not, we tend to think that, nobody believed in this God. They just turned away. It's especially, when Cain and Abel have their kerfuffle, when Abel is murdered, who's going to believe in God, especially after a time. But we see here very clearly that, first of all, if you're going to be a priest, you're going to have a congregation, right? Because he's also king. So there are people who still believe in the one true God. And I just find that really, really interesting. And I just like to bring that out. So, moving on. Joseph. Now, okay, so let's go through the genealogy here. We have Abraham, who begot Isaac. Begot is the word that you use for a man who is the father of a child. So with a woman, you would say, she birthed. Well, a man can't birth anyone, right? But he can begot. So we have Abraham begot Isaac. Isaac begot Jacob and Esau, twins. And if you read through the book of Genesis, you'll find more of the story, of course. And then Jacob, who we refer to in the Old Testament, you see the Hebrews referring to the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. So we're looking through Jacob's line, and it's Jacob who eventually has his name changed to Israel. Israel has 12 sons, and son number 11 is Joseph. And Joseph is the favored son, and the other sons don't like that. It ticks them off. So one day they throw him in a pit, and when some Egyptian slave traders come by, they sell him as a slave. They take back his fancy clothes that his daddy gave him, and they've ripped them up and they've dipped them in blood, and they say, hey, your favorite son Joseph is dead. Joseph then goes to Egypt, and while he's in Egypt, you can again read this entire story in the book of Genesis. Joseph gets to Egypt, and while he's there, he makes a very good name for himself. And eventually, kind of sort of basically like works his way out of bondage to become a sort of a favorite among one of the Egyptians. But that Egyptian's wife tries to seduce Joseph. And Joseph, being an honorable man, is like, no, no, you're my boss's wife. It's not going to happen. And so Joseph's boss's wife lies about him, and Joseph is put into prison. And while he's in prison, he interprets some dreams, and eventually, after several years, that gets to Pharaoh, and Pharaoh starts having, Pharaoh has had some dreams that are very disturbing. Nobody can tell him what they're about except for Joseph. So Joseph comes in, he interprets the dreams and says, hey, look, there's going to be 7 years of really good times. Like, we're going to have a whole lot of food, and then we're going to have 7 years of really, really bad times. There's going to be 7 years of famine, no food. So we need to store up now. And Joseph becomes Pharaoh's right-hand man. He's like vice president, okay? He is vice Pharaoh of Egypt, as it were. And after a period of time, Joseph's brothers come, and they are... his brothers go to Egypt looking for food, because during this time of famine, of course, other people are starving. So they know that Egypt has food. So they go to Egypt looking for food. And long story short, Joseph gets them to bring back his father and all of his father's household so that he might be able to provide for them during the famine. Something else that's very interesting is, this is again another one of those little tidbits of the Old Testament that I just find, kind of fun. My husband pointed this out. We have Joseph and the old guy, okay? So Joseph, he's gotten his father and all of his father's household to come. He's been reunited with his family, and he introduces his dad, Israel. He introduces Israel to Pharaoh. And when he gets there, this is what Pharaoh says. Pharaoh says, how old are you? Talking to Israel. He's wanting to know, how old are you? Now, even if you're Pharaoh, who's going to start off by asking that question to somebody? So I've had the question before, like, okay, we talk about how these people had a particular, life expectancy, and yet we see in the scriptures how the Hebrew people tend to live a little bit longer. Well, this is one of those little throwaway stories almost that's included that tells us, well, these people, there's some sort of anomaly within this family line to where the patriarchs are living much longer than several of the people around them. So here we have Pharaoh saying, how old are you? And he's like, well, I'm this old, but, my daddy and my granddaddy, they outlived me. They will, their years far outnumber mine. Now, when they get there, because Pharaoh loves Joseph so much, he gives the Hebrews the best land in Egypt. It's referred to as the land of Goshen. And life looks pretty good. But after a period of time, Joseph dies. Some years later, there's a different Pharaoh who never knew Joseph, who had no connection to the Hebrews, and they are concerned about the prosperity of the Hebrews. There's so many of them that Pharaoh enslaved them, bringing about the prophecy that God gave to Abraham so long ago. They were enslaved for around about 400 years until a man named Moses appeared. And Moses, we see Moses as the first messianic figure. Messianic figure. So when we see the word Messiah, we think anointed one. This is a special chosen person by God, sent to lead the people, sent to lead his people. And Moses is really like the first messianic figure in Hebrew history. So here comes Moses, and again, you can read about his story, late Genesis and in the book of Exodus. And Moses, eventually, after lots of plagues, the Pharaoh finally lets them go, and he leads the people for over 40 years in the wilderness because of disobedience, wanting to go back to Egypt, worshiping idols, all that kind of stuff. And then his helper Joshua, because Moses also disobeyed God at one point and was not allowed to enter into the promised land. Moses' helper Joshua led the Hebrews into the promised land. Now, the Hebrew people were set apart for many reasons, but these people were obviously different from everyone else because of how joyful they were. Yahweh, which is the name that God gave himself when speaking to Moses, is the God of life. All the laws, every scripture, were teeming with life. God loves life, and he wants his people to enjoy the life that he's given them. His laws, they were never meant to restrict them or to make them depressed, but to give them the ultimate joy and satisfaction in life. It's interesting to note that not everybody who called on the Hebrew God was in fact Hebrew by blood. So there were some people who were not of Jewish descent, and they called on the name of the Lord, and these people were called God-fearing.